Empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men, shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives.
Welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. This show is based on the simple idea that every Black man is capable of creating inner peace, dynamic health, great relationships, and financial abundance. Therefore, we provide insights and strategies to educate, motivate, and inspire Black men to reach their full potential and create the life of their dreams. So if you're ready for some high-octane motivation and inspiration that supports and empowers you to live the life you were born to live, get ready to shatter the stereotypes so you can build a life that lights you up and positively impacts the world. So now, let's shatter the stereotypes with your host, Coach Michael Taylor.
Hello and welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where our intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. You see, there's never been a shortage of Black male role models. There's only been a lack of exposure of those role models. So the intention here is to showcase and highlight Black men who are doing amazing things in the world. And joining me today is a guy who is doing just that. His name is Dr. Armon Perry, and he's a professor at the University of Louisville, Kent School of Social Work. So without further ado, let's welcome him to the show. Dr. Perry, how you doing this evening?
I'm pretty good, Michael. How about you?
All right, doing fantastic, man. So glad you've taken the time to join us on the podcast. As mentioned, we want to highlight and showcase Black men who are doing amazing things, and you are definitely doing that. We're going to talk a little bit about your work and your book, but first of all, let's kind of jump in with a few icebreaker questions. So first of all, tell us where you're from and give us a little bit of idea what it was like growing up for you.
Okay. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, but I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. So Alabama is home. What was it like growing up? Growing up was interesting. My dad was in the military, so my family bounced around a good bit. We lived in a number of different, everything from North Dakota to Honolulu, Columbus, Mississippi, and a handful of other places as well. So we bounced around a good bit until my mom and dad got divorced, and then we settled there in Montgomery, where my mother. And when I talk, I sound like I'm from Alabama, so I got to claim it, even know whether I wanted to or not. But again, Alabama is home. Yeah, a big family, surrounded by a lot of love, a lot of encouragement. Grew up believing that whatever it is I wanted to do, if I set my mind to it, I could do it. And anything that I didn't do or hadn't done, it was only because I hadn't either set my mind to it or I just hadn't had long enough to figure it out. So, and I owe that to my folks. They set me out with a course to be confident and to blaze my own trail. And so those are things that I've sort of always been appreciative of, and try to be half of as much of an inspiration and a rock of stability to my own kids as my mother was to me. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Nice.
When I'm not working, again, I went to school in Alabama, did my undergraduate work at Alabama State, a small HBCU in my hometown, and did all my graduate work at the University of Alabama. So when I'm not working and hanging out with the family, I'm usually watching college football. So that's all of that is a function of where I'm from.
There you go. All right. So name a woman who inspired you to be who you are.
Oh, that's easy. Daisy Perry, my mother.
Okay. And name a man that you look up to and admire.
A man, let's go with Marshawn Brown. That's my stepdad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, name a book that you love and tell me why you love it.
Dr. Seuss.
Oh,
Older places you'll go, right?
isn't it amazing how Dr. Seuss, because I mean, I'm 60 And
Uh-huh.
I still love Dr. Seuss. I still love Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think this is a title of a book. Everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten. I think that's a title of a book, but I found it to be true though, right?
Yeah.
When you think about some of the core and basic principles you learn as a small 4, 5, and 6 year old kid, if it's possible to hang on to those things and sort of develop a routine of implementing and practicing those things, if you can do that in a relatively consistent manner, for the most part, you'll be fine. And imagine a world if all of us did that, right? If all of us stuck to those core principles that we were taught and that we learned in elementary school. So yeah, so Dr. Seuss is a go-to for me. It's also the case that much of the way that I understand the world is through either cartoons or hip hop music. So which is a weird and interesting sort of a juxtaposition. But I oftentimes make references to cartoons or to hip hop because again, that's the way that I understand the world. But if I didn't go with Dr. Seuss, Older Places Will Go. Um, I think another one that was really, really inspirational for me was Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro.
Okay.
Uh, so those are two go-tos for me.
So let's move over to, we're talking culture. So if you love movies, name one of your favorite movies.
This is easy for me. New Jack City. New Jack City is the best thing in the history of cinema, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, New Jack City. I think
All
it was
right.
a perfect microcosm of American society and culture. The combination of patriarchy and capitalism, and the ways in which those things lead to exploitation, and which is as American as American Pie, Chevrolet, and baseball. But then, as soon as Black people start to learn the rules of the game and start to play the game by those rules, America tries to flip the script and say, no, 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 we can't do that anymore. So anyway, we could do a whole semester on New Jack City, but New Jack City is my favorite movie for all of those reasons.
Okay. So if I grabbed your phone right now, your MP3 player, who would be on your playlist?
Oh man, you get everything from Tupac to Frank Sinatra to Katy Perry to Young Jeezy and everything in between. I got off the treadmill earlier this about an hour or so ago, and the last thing that was on was a group called the Lawn Boys, and it's a local group from my hometown in Montgomery, Alabama. A group of kids who, well, they aren't kids anymore, but they grew up in a neighborhood called South Lawn, and they had a couple of sort of local hits and so on and so forth. So anyway, so you get a little bit of everything. Again, music is a place for me to go to sort of escape the the monotony of the everyday. And so during this time of year, it's not uncommon to find me on the treadmill, sort of zoning out. When the weather's decent, I just take laps around the block, and that's how I clear my mind. So
There you go.
Lawn Boys was the last thing on the MP4.
Now, if I gave you a magic wand and you could create anything your heart desired, what would your life look like 10 years from now?
This is after I make myself independently wealthy.
That can be a part of it.
Okay, well, so that's gonna be first. After I make myself independently wealthy, the second thing I would do is I would eradicate any and all division of labor along gender lines. I would de-gender parenting. That's what I would do.
Oh,
So
wow.
I would make myself independently wealthy. I would do that for me. And then my gift to the world would be I would de-gender parenting so that every single kid would have two people, a mother and a father, who did not stop and think, is this my job because I either have an X or Y chromosome, but they would just say, you know what, that kid has 23 of my chromosomes, and so whatever it is that needs to be done, I'm going to jump in and do it.
Mm,
That would be my gift to the world after I make myself independently wealthy.
there you go. Now, there are some people who are pretty pessimistic about the future, while others are pretty optimistic. So, where do you fall on the spectrum between optimism and pessimism for the future in general? Where do you fall?
Hmm. Can I ask a follow up? Are we talking optimism and pessimism for me, or are we talking for the world?
In general, just
In
in
general,
general.
I guess I gotta go optimism. I can't say pessimism, right? I gotta. If I'm not optimistic, what am I going to do tomorrow? You know, and why would I do it? You know what I mean? So I'm gonna go optimism. If we're talking about specifically for me, I'm really, really optimistic. But for the world in general, I'm fairly optimistic even still.
Okay.
I gotta be, because otherwise, what's our reason for being?
I agree. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Perry, the professional. So tell the audience what you do.
Okay, I'm a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Louisville. I tell my students that basically the way my job works is my job is to go out and learn as much about a topic that is of interest to me and share it with as many people who are willing to listen. And so, in other words, there are three realms of responsibility at my job. And for pretty much any academic, particularly an academic at a research university. So first and foremost is my research. My research has two arms to it. One is fathers and their involvement with their children. Two is Black men and their contributions to family functioning. So my research revolves around those two topical areas. The second realm of responsibility is teaching. As it stands now, I teach intro to social work. So it's a class for mostly freshmen and sophomores, students who feel like they may have an interest in becoming a social worker, but they're just sort of filling it out and want to see whether or not this is something that they want to spend their life doing. And so we go through about 10 different fields of practice, try to debunk some myths. Folks have some preconceived notions about what they think social work is, usually because they've seen it on like Law and Order or some bad sort of Hollywood depiction or portrayal that paints social workers in this really, really weird light. But anyway, so we spent some time debunking myths and introducing them to about 10 different fields of practice. So there's the research, there's a teaching, and then there's a service component, service to the local community. I serve on a couple of nonprofit boards here in town, service to the university. Get stuck doing committee work at the university, and then also serve on a couple of professional boards that are sort of national professional boards in the field of social work. So research, teaching, and service, those are the realms of responsibility, with the first two taking precedence over the third. And my university is a research university. So the honest truth is the thing that we spend most of our time thinking about and doing is the research, because that's the thing that's rewarded in our field. So, but I owe a lot to the educators who coached me up and trained me as an emerging scholar and as a young person. So I take my teaching seriously. I think that for me, education is a lot like HDTV. And so I tell my students that once you learn things, you cannot unlearn them. And it's a lot like going from watching that small TV that sat on the big TV at your grandmother's house to watching a 75-inch flat screen in 4K, right? The world sort of opens up to you, and you just can't go back to watching the small TV that sits on the big TV. The world is no longer the same. You won't be the same once you become a learned and educated person. So I take that responsibility very, very seriously.
Nice. Now, one of my books is titled The Cure for Onlyness, A Black Man's Guide to Joy, Passion, and Purpose. And the book addresses the feeling of onlyness that we as Black men sometimes feel when we're the only Black person or the only person of color within an environment. So I'm absolutely certain that you've had that experience. And if so, how do you deal with it?
So to answer the question, absolutely, I've experienced that several times, and I don't have to tell you this, but I'm sure you already know, and I would imagine most of your listeners know as well. Every sort of step or every rung that you ascend on whatever this sort of professional ladder is, the lonelier or the onlier it gets, right? You find yourself in really, really rarefied air. So how to deal with that? I don't know. I think I like to think of myself as a pragmatist and as a realist, and so I just deal with things as they come. Now, it's also the case that I mentioned to you that I'm an ex-military brat, so I have quite a bit of experience being the new guy, right? I'm also so anyway. So in addition to having quite a bit of experience being the new guy, I'm also from a neighborhood in Montgomery, Alabama that was inhabited by Crips, Bloods, Vice Lords, and Gangster Disciples. But it was Montgomery, Alabama, so there was still a whole bunch of racist white people too. And so being able to sort of, I think code switch is the language that's oftentimes used. Code switch, sort of build and develop and cultivate relationships in a strategic manner, is something that I grew up having to do. You wouldn't have made it out of the neighborhood had you not been able to do that. So it's almost a sort of a Darwinian survival of the fittest type situation, right? The people who don't develop those types of skill sets, they don't make it. And so for those of us who were able to sort of figure that out and navigate that and be able to successfully negotiate it, it's something that you can take with you. It's also the case that my first full-time job was in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives. And so I learned there, if I didn't learn anything else, that what you say matters less than whether or not you can say it in a way that resonates with other people.
Mm.
So what that means is you necessarily have to spend time sort of thinking about and assessing people to see what drives them, what motivates them, because if it is you're looking to get something out of them, you do yourself a lot of favors by being able to frame and craft your message in a way that is more likely to land with them, even if it means it doesn't come across or is framed as a way that you would initially or intuitively put it. So I think all of those things put together have helped me deal with this sense of onlyness that you mentioned, I think.
Yeah, and I get a sense that you mentioned Darwin, and he always said that the ones that would survive would be the ones who could adapt to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so that ability to adapt to change, to adapt to environments, to adapt to, like I said, the different segments of society is the key to success. As a man who happens to be Black, obviously we become really good at adapting. I think that's one of our gifts. I think that's how we've survived in this country, our ability to adapt. But I also know that it can be lonely sometimes. As Black men, I know that my very first book, I wrote a book called Brothers Are You Listening? A Success Guide for the New Millennium. And the very first chapter was called the That's What White People Do mentality. And in that chapter, I talked about how most of my life, I've been accused of being a sellout because of how I speak and because I used to love to surf and ride skateboards and listen to rock music. So, there can be that almost disconnection because you're attacked, because maybe you think a little differently. But once again, I think it comes back to adaptability, because I've always been comfortable with my ethnicity. I've always been comfortable with my Blackness, but I also trust my own heart. I also trust how I feel, what works for me. And I was never afraid to do things that worked for me, even though my peer group may have disagreed. So it's important for us to have that sense of adaptability as we navigate through this thing called America. Now, there's a lot of talk about the lack of Black male teachers. So as a Black professor, what do you think we can do possibly to change that?
What can we do to change that? I I think that that's a really good question. Again, you're talking to someone who works at a university where there are, if I'm not mistaken, close to 1,800 faculty, and maybe 150 of them are Black, right? So less than 10%. Um, and when you're talking full-time professors at the rank of professor, which is at the highest rank, there may be like 27, 28 at the whole university, right? Which is outrageous. That to me, that borders on criminal, right? And so this is a really, really important question, because it's not all that uncommon for me to get students to show up, and this is obviously pre-pandemic, just show up in my office unsolicited, no appointment, no nothing, just cold call, knocking on my door saying, Doc, I don't know you and you don't know me, but I heard you were a Black dude in social work.
Mm.
Right. And so folks are just looking for a familiar face, right? And what's interesting is I've been at the University of Louisville for 12 years, so I've been there for quite some time now. And although chronologically, most of the people that I work with are still older than me from a sort of a tenure standpoint, I've been there for, again, a good bit of time. And in many circles, I, not just me, but people who otherwise you wouldn't think would be seen as sort of senior scholars, like that's sort of the space that I'm in, which is crazy because, again, like when I'm not at work or when I'm walking to class, like I'm literally listening to like the same mixtapes that my students are listening to. You know what I mean? Um, and so, I mean, so that's cool. And I appreciate having people sort of look to me in that way. But I think that, again, it's another space and another area that's really, really lonely, right? Um, and when I think about, to me, like this sort of the sad reality that folks just show up again, sometimes not even in my major, right? But they're just looking for somebody to have some discussion, conversation with about, hey, like this is what happened today. Like, what should I think about this? Am I tripping if I'm believing this, or like what's going on here, so on and so forth. Um, Especially like first generation students, right? Um, so anyway, so back to your question, what can we do? What should we do? Um, I think we just got to get more aggressive. And by we, I mean like these universities, these school systems. We have to get more aggressive about recruiting. I was getting ready to say people of color, but let me stop. I don't want to say people of color. I want to speak specifically about Black people, right? Because sometimes people say people of color, and like that's coded language for like international folks. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
And again, I'm a Black man who is a son of the American South, and so I know better than to support state-sanctioned discrimination. Like I'll be the biggest butthole in the world if I were to do anything like that. So when I say this, I want to be clear that I harbor no ill will, no animus toward any group of people. Again, that runs counter to my people's entire existence in this place. But I also believe that America has a special sort of hatred for Black people, right? And given that that's the case, I think that the remedy should be special and unique. Uh, and so we ought to be targeting Black communities. We ought to be, and when I say target, I'm talking about funneling additional resources aimed specifically at Black communities to inhabit these classrooms and these universities with people who look like the student bodies that universities are clamoring to recruit because it fits and supports their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, right? You got to be able to do that on the faculty side as well and the administration side, right? Because you got to have decision makers. Because as we both know, right, if, as has been said, if you don't have a seat at the table, right, you might be on the menu. You know what I mean? Right. And so anyways, so we have to get more aggressive. We have to take these things seriously. We have to put our money where our mouth is. And the biggest thing that we need is we need courage, because there's always going to be a faction of our society that pushes back and say, well, that's reverse discrimination, or you can't use race as a metric for creating different types of programs. And no, that's foolishness, because again, America has been willful and intentional about locking our people out of these situations. And so we got to be willful and intentional about redressing those issues and creating the type of equality that America claims it's all about, right? And so I think that's what's needed. We need courage. We need access to resources. We need seats at the table. And we also got to have the right kind of folks in those seats, because some of our people, even if they land in these spots and spaces, some of them are skin folk, but they ain't kin folk, right? Like, let's be clear. Some of these folks Harriet Tubman would have left behind, right? Right. And so I think we need to strategic about once we get access to opportunities and we're looking to create pipelines. I think we need to be really, really intentional about the people that we put or we nominate for these positions, because if we don't, then we could have folks who don't mean us well and set us back, right? So again, so I don't know if I'm even really responding to the question, but these are the things that come to my mind, right?
Yeah,
I think.
and I think you're right on. Systemically, obviously, there's some issues, but I think one thing that's been missing from us
Mhm.
is exposure. How do we put people like yourself
Mhm.
in front of the young black men so they can see what's possible? Because if we pay attention to mainstream media, what are we going to get? So the reason that I launched this podcast is I wanted to put people like you up front so that young black men could be exposed to conversations with men like yourself. Because all of my life, as I mentioned, I've been accused of not being black because of maybe how I think or my optimistic attitude. But I also know that I believe everybody has a divine purpose. And so for me, my purpose is to share the information that I've learned with others to empower, and especially black men. How do
Mhm.
we empower black men? Because right now, I think if nothing else, we need inspiration, motivation, and education. That's what we need. We need those three things. So how do we inspire ourselves? How do we educate ourselves? And having these types of dialogues, I believe, contributes to that. And that's my way of coming up with a solution.
Mhm.
Again, I think it's as you mentioned, it goes a lot deeper than that. But when we can give people like yourself the opportunity to get in front of young men and say, hey, look, this is what's possible. Look at
Mhm.
where I started and look at where I ended up. I mean, to me, that's inspiring. And I think we really need more of that now more than ever. So, with that being said, why did you decide to become a professor anyway?
Okay, so here we go. So there's a Reader's Digest version, and there's a sort of a little bit more extended version. I'm gonna try to. Brevity has never been a strong suit of mine, right? Uh, but I'm gonna try to give you the answer, but do so in a way that doesn't drag the thing out. So, long story short, when I was in like the eighth, ninth, and 10th grade, I was a knucklehead, right? Like school was a thing that I did because my mother sent me, and I would get in trouble if I didn't go. You know what I mean? But I'm from a place where, and it's so interesting what you were just talking about. You talked about the exposure and talking about the inspiration and the visualization and so on and so forth. I tend to agree with everything that you were saying there, because I think it's tough to develop a vision beyond your block, right?
Yes.
Uh, and it's also the case that I grew up in the 90s. This was like before the internet. So it's like you couldn't just sort of log on to the World Wide Web and start envisioning these things that were sort of foreign to you. But I think even in a contemporary way where you still have access to those types of things, I think folks still, it's something different to have it tangible to you. You know what I mean? So in a way, so when I was in like junior high and the early part of my high school, I was just sort of going through the motions. And when I was set to graduate, the benchmark for success in my neighborhood was whether or not your car had automatic windows and the air conditioner worked. So if you didn't have to lean over and roll the window down, if you just push a button, like you were the man in my neighborhood, right? And so I'll never forget when I was in high school. So I graduated high school in 1997. When I was in high school, there was a car lot that was right around the street from my grandmother's house, and they had a 1992 Honda Prelude on the lot. So again, I graduated in 97. So at the time, this car was already 5 years old, right? So they had a 1992 Honda Prelude, and this was the baddest car you've ever seen in your life, right? I was like, man, like if I can get my hands on that car, like I'm gonna be the man in my neighborhood. Like it had a sunroof, it had a spoiler on the back, it already had rims on it. I mean, it was just like it was just gonna be like magical, right? So anyway, I met a guy who ran a rug warehouse, And he told me, he said, once you graduate, you can get a job at the warehouse. And if you do well, you can rent a forklift and you can make 8.25 an hour, $8.25 an hour. And so I started doing the math. I was like, okay, 8.25 times 40 hours a week. That's like a little over $300 a week times four. That's a little over $1,200 a month. Man, I could get that Honda Prelude and I'll still have money to go and hang out on the weekend. And so this was my plan for life, right? Um, until until I got to the 11th grade, bumped into a woman named Vivian Ledbetter. She was my 11th grade literature teacher. And she kept trying to force the Iliad and the Odyssey down our throats and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's like, come on, like, I'm not reading that. Like, nobody in my neighborhood knows anything about the Woman of Bath. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what we talk about in my neighborhood. And again, I'm going nowhere with that anyway, right? So she recognized that there was no chance I was going to do anything with the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Canterbury Tales. She comes to me, she says, "What are you interested in?" She called me one day after school. And I said, "Well, like, what do you mean?" She's like, "What are you interested in?" I said, "Well, Tupac just came out with a double album, All Eyes on Me, and it was the best thing in the history of music as far as I was concerned." So she said, "Okay, well, bring it in." Like, see, the CD-ROM had just come out, right? And so Miss Ledbetter she was a 70-year-old white lady. But to her credit, she sat down in her classroom every single day for about 2 weeks, and she could only stomach one song. I'm sure her ears would bleed leaving out of that classroom in the afternoon. But to her credit, every day after school for about 2 weeks, she sat down and she listened to one song from the album. And she said, for whatever reason, you like this stuff. And if you're willing to actually do a comparison contrast paper between Tupac's All Eyes on Me versus his Me Against the World album, the album that came immediately before that, I'll let you switch your topic for your documented essay, which was the major project for the English Lit class. And so I'm like, okay, cool. Anyway, long story a little bit shorter, that's what I did. So the rest of the class, they were doing Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and like Dante's Inferno and whatever this other stuff was. Meanwhile, I was listening to Me Against the World and All Eyes on Me and doing a comparison sort of a paper. Well, I ended up passing the class, and the next year, going into my 12th grade year, when I signed up for home ec, because that's where the girls were, they wouldn't let me take home ec because I had a special request on my choice form for a journalism class. Ms. Ledbetter had recommended me to write for the school newspaper and had worked out an arrangement to where I would do a music column. So every Tuesday when the new music came out, students would send in recommendations or CDs or cassettes or whatever the case was. I would take it home and listen to it, write a music column, and it would appear in the school newspaper. And so anyway, so like that was when like the light bulb went off. Like I can now see the utility of education. So it's not just reading books because the teacher said so, but if you learn, you can actually do something with it, and you could possibly put yourself on a track to be able to use this stuff to support yourself through a vocation or a job for the rest of your life. And so at that point, it's like, okay, well, never mind the 8.25 at the rug warehouse running the forklift. Maybe I can be like a journalist or something like that. I don't know, right? And so at the time, Ed Gordon used to do the news on BET,
Oh yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
And so, like, I would double up and watch Video Soul with Donnie Simpson and Sherry Carter. I don't know if you remember Sherry Carter. I had the biggest crush on Sherry Carter. Oh my God. Anyway, so I could watch Donnie Simpson and Sherry Carter, and I can get my music fix, and then double up and watch the news with Ed Gordon. So anyway, so it just sort of put me on a track to realize that there was utility in education. Long story a little bit shorter, when it came time for me to pick my job, I'm a social worker by trade, but for any number of reasons, I decided to go back and work on a Ph.D. because I wanted to put myself in position to train the next generation of social workers. And so the reason why I do what I do, this is 5 minutes of life you'll never be able to get back. But in a lot of ways, it's an attempt to pay back the people who poured so much into me. Because if we were sort of to go over the chronology of my life, it seems like just at the right time, there were so many people who just showed up and were strategically placed in my life that got me to whatever the next little space was, right? And again, it started with my mother keeping her foot literally and figuratively planted firmly in my backside to keep me out of trouble and keep me going forward. But then even when I got beyond whatever the experiences of my family of origin were, there were always people strategically placed in my life who just caught me and moved me to the next little station. And so if I could be there, and so I always feel indebted to those people, even to this day. And so if I can serve in that sort of a capacity for anybody else, I feel like I've served my purpose. You talked about purpose a little earlier.
What
So
a fantastic story. That's
yeah,
amazing. Isn't it amazing how teachers, and this is why teachers are so important, and it still amazes me how, as a society, we don't value teachers because of the impact they have on our lives. I had a teacher in elementary school named Miss Bussy, happened to be a white woman. And Miss Bussy knew the violent situation that I was in as a kid. But she took it upon herself to make sure that when the kids were not in the class and I was the only one there, she'd hug me. And she'd tell me, Michael, everything's going to be okay. Because I'd come to school with scars and stuff like that. And CPS was being called on me several times. So she knew, that I just needed that special attention. And she ingrained in me in elementary school that the key to my success in getting my life in order, if you will, was right here. She says, Michael, she says, you're a genius. She said, you're so, so smart. I just need you to focus. She says, if you'll just focus on your work, she says, and use your brain. She says, you can get out of the situation. And in elementary school, she was my rock because I was separated from my mom. And again, a bad situation. But this woman took it upon herself to give me that special attention and that love and that support that I needed as a kid. And to this day, she is probably, after my mom, the most influential person in my life because she set me on the path of learning and understanding that this was the key. And I'm forever indebted to her.
yeah, absolutely.
So
And just like Dr. Seuss said, older places you'll go, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So now I want to talk about what you're really passionate about and what you do. So you started a program called the For Your Child program. So tell us a little bit about why you started it and what it was about.
Okay. So again, a little bit of background. Again, by trade, I'm a social worker. And so back in the early 2000s, I was, you just mentioned CPS. So if I lived in your hometown, that may have been me knocking on the door, right? Like I was a foster care social worker working with kids who the state of Alabama said didn't have parents who were willing or able to take care of them. What I found was, as I got to meet families, that wasn't true as often as the state said it was, right? And so we weren't doing really much of anything to reach out to dads. Um, and so family services was really code for moms and kids, right? Dad was not really even a part of the equation, right? There was no real expectation that we reach out to dad. There was no expectation that we even know who dad was. There was no expectation that we even asked. I found that curious because the agency that I worked for was called the Department of Human Resources, right? So imagine the irony, right? At the Department of Human Resources, we were being willful and intentional about cutting ourselves off from half of the kids' family. And so I just started doing like reconnaissance work on my own, trying to figure out who these guys were, what their situations were, because I was just looking for resources for the kids. And in tracking down some of these guys, I realized that not a lot of them would have been viable placement options, but all of those men had brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, mothers, brothers, cousins, and surely the kids would have been better off living with a paternal relative rather than just hanging out with us in foster care. You know what I mean? And so it was then when I started to take a real interest in the role that fathers play in the family. Because I worked for an agency that was supposed to be about supporting families, and we were doing the exact opposite, right? We were pushing dads out. It's like, man, this is crazy. This is backwards. Um, I would flash back from time to time to being in Miss Ledbetter's class, and she would force, say, for instance, Macbeth down our throat, right? And I would go to my job, and we would have to file termination of parental rights petitions to permanently separate kids from their families so they would be free to be adopted. I would look down at my hands, and I, like, oh my God, like I just killed Duncan, right? Like just like on Macbeth, you know what I mean? because I felt like I had those families' blood on my hands just by going to work and doing my job. I was separating families rather than doing what I thought I was there to do, which was to help people. I found myself complicit in a system of oppression, which is the exact opposite of what I was there to do. And so um, when I went back to graduate school, again, as I mentioned, with the express intention to position myself to train the next generation of social workers, I had to pick a research topic because a PhD is a research degree. And so for me, it was a natural and organic sort of a fit to work with dads. So the For Your Child project was just basically a continuation of my interest in working with men and working with dads so that they could increase their capacity for taking more active roles in their children's lives. It's also the case that, and I tell people this, I grew up playing Little League Baseball, but I wasn't very good. And the coach told me once, he said, Perry, swing hard just in case you hit it, right? Uh, and so I figured that if I'm going to be doing this work, then I needed to swing hard just in case I hit it. And to my way of thinking, that was the case, and still is the case, that the biggest area for growth, the biggest opportunity for impact is working with dads. Again, imagine a situation, this gets back to the second thing I would do with that magic wand you asked me about. Imagine a situation where every single child had two people who would do whatever it was that it took to make sure that that child had a healthy and safe childhood, without regard to whether or not they were male, female, man, woman, dad, mom. No, you just had two parents who would go to the nth degree to make sure that you had everything that you needed. We would literally change the world overnight, right? And so that is my job. That's what gets me up in the morning, to create a situation where every single child has at least two people who will go to the mat to make sure that they have everything they need. And so For Your Child is a project where we enroll non-resident dads into a program that features 28 hours of parent education and some case management services. So we try to work specifically with dads around parenting, co-parenting, communication, conflict resolution, child development, discipline, um, as well as getting them connected to resources in and around the community that can help them either find a job, or if they already have a job, find a job that pays a higher wage, or find a job that works better with their schedule that allows them to take more active roles in their kids' lives. So anyway, so that's what we do. We've been at it for a little over 5 years. Project started through a grant from the federal government, and so what we've learned is that many of the dads that we've worked with, because they're non-resident dads, they've been marginalized and pushed aside in some cases away from their children for quite some time now. So what we're looking to do now is retool that program so that we can work with a younger set of parents to get involved and intervene before they get to the point where there's so much co-parenting baggage and co-parenting scar tissue, where moms and dads are sort of at each other's throats and not willing to work together in the spirit of cooperation. So our new project is taking what we've learned from For Your Child and retooling it so that we work with adolescent and young adult parents to do some of the same things: healthy relationships, responsible parenting, economic mobility, that sort of thing.
Nice. Now, my specialty is the changing roles of manhood and masculinity in society. It's what I've been writing about for the past 25 years. And I think the most important shift in this country is a re-emphasis on fathers. Because, as men, we've been conditioned to believe that, we have basically three primary responsibilities: provide, protect, and procreate.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, as men, we weren't taught how to connect. And there's a disconnect emotionally that a lot of men experience because we just haven't had the role models, if you will, of men teaching us how to authentically be men.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I loved is I saw a little video that you posted about an exercise that you do with men with some blue and yellow balloons. Tell us about that exercise.
Yeah, the balloon activity. And so one of the opening activities in our curriculum, in our fatherhood program, is what we call the balloon activity. And the setup is we bring the dads into the space, and every dad gets a bag full of balloons, and you get yellow balloons and you get blue balloons. Blue balloons represent your responsibilities and your obligations, whether it be a mortgage, car payment, student loans, electric bill, whatever the case may be. Yellow balloons represent your children. So the dads write the names of their children on the yellow balloons. They write the names or the title of their responsibility or obligations on the blue balloons. And as you might imagine, the more responsibilities and the more children you might have a handful of balloons, depending on what your situation are. So at all at one time, and again, we would usually have anywhere from 10 to 15 dads in the room. And so there's a lot of balloons. So all at once, we say go. And the activity is designed for the dads to throw all of their balloons up into the air. And the object of the activity is for them to juggle all of their balloons without allowing any of them to hit the ground. Sort of a microcosm for life, right? This idea that you don't want the ball, you don't want to drop the ball, you don't want the egg to slip through the cracks or whatever case may be. You certainly don't want the balloon to hit the ground. And if any of the balloons are going to hit the ground, you definitely don't want the yellow balloon to hit the ground because that represents your children. Even if your electric bill has to slip for a month, or even if the car payment is late, if it hits the ground, that's one thing, but you can't let little Bobby hit the ground. You can't let Sally hit the ground, right? And so 10 to 15 guys, 50, 60 easily balloons in the air is basically a madhouse, right? And typically what happens is a dad will get into a space where he overdoes it when he pops one of his balloons into the air and it starts to get away from him. And so you got dads bumping into one another. You got balloons being crossed over. You got people pushing other people's balloons all over the place. Like it's just going. And so anyway, and almost inevitably what'll happen is as one of those yellow balloons is about to hit the ground, without being prompted to, one of the other dads will sort of reach down and he'll have just a spare second or two and he'll pop it back up and give the original dad just enough time to get back on his feet, get himself together, and keep sort of juggling his balloons, right? And so at that point in time, our facilitators are instructed to stop the activity and say, okay, well, now, did everyone see that? And what was the lesson learned from it, right? And the idea there is this, again, this is a teachable moment that suggests to guys that none of us are alone. You don't have to be alone, right? This parenting work is really, really difficult work. It's almost impossible if you're trying to do it alone. And so you necessarily need support. And so for us, we start to steer them to the idea that there has to be at least one other person whose job it is to assist you and to support you, and you support them in this parenting work. And usually we're talking about the child's mom, right? And so that gives us an opportunity to set a foundation and talk about cooperative co-parenting, because that's a theme that we come back to over and over and over again throughout the 28 hours in the curriculum. But again, whether it be co-parenting or whether it be any other type of relationship, necessarily working together in a spirit of cooperation as opposed to in isolation or competition is a much better way to get things done, right? So anyway, so that's an opportunity for us to sort of symbolically represent that through a fun and engaging sort of an activity. It's one that we start with because it helps us to create a foundation for some of the other things that we like to talk about and teach in the program.
That's amazing. That's a really powerful exercise.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah. And it comes from our curriculum. The curriculum is developed by the National Fatherhood Initiative, so I can't take credit for developing it. But again, we put our own spin on it so that we make it sort of come to life in ways that really, really resonate with the dads. And as you mentioned, symbolic as it is, but it's really, really powerful. And the message almost always hits home to the guy.
Nice. Now, you are the author of Black Love Matters: Authentic Voices on Marriages and Romantic Relationships. And as a matter of fact, that's how I was introduced to your work. I read an article that you had written, and that's why I reached out to you. Because again, my work is with men, and I really put a lot of focus on Black men in specifically. And there's this illusion about Black men and love. And I'm looking at, and I have not read your book, but I have the chapters that I like to go over. But I get the sense that based on what I read and what you were saying is you and I have the same philosophy that obviously as Black men, we are capable of creating loving, intimate, caring relationships, but you very seldom see or hear Black men talking about relationships this way. So first of all, what is the primary message that people will get out of your book? What's the primary message that you want to get across?
If we were in an elevator and I only had 30 seconds to tell you what the book is about, I would tell you that the book is about Black men loving and wanting to be loved, right? And this is Black men telling you how it is they love and how they want to be loved, so that you don't have to rely on media depictions or pop cultural portrayals that will frame us in deficit, negative based ways. Because I think that's what you get when you turn on the TV or when you turn on the internet. Again, I talked to you a while ago about having some interest in journalism as a younger person. And I know that one of the axioms in journalism is this idea that if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so when we think about the way in which Black men have been and continue to be portrayed in much of the media, there's not much balance to those discussions, right? And so those stereotypes, I think, are dangerous. They're harmful. They're problematic, and people absorb those things, and it seeps into their skin, into their consciousness. Not much different than the lotion that you and I put on our bodies every morning. And people walk around with that, and they've created a narrative about who and what we are. And it's one that is not at all accurate when you sit down and actually talk to Black men, right? Rather than simply talking about Black men. So anyway, so that's what the book is about. It's about how Black men love and want to be loved.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I started this show, Shatter the Stereotypes, because as a matter of fact, I wrote an entire book called Shattering Black Male Stereotypes, as you can see behind me here. And I basically break down what I call the 10 most destructive media-generated illusions about Black men. And one of those illusions is that Black men can't be monogamous. You know, we get attached to this whole, rap culture, and you think, okay, so that's how all Black men look at women, and it's not the truth. But I want to break down just to kind of touch bases on your chapters in your book, because I think it's an important book. And you're writing more from a research perspective. Is that, again, I haven't read the book. And I noticed that you had some other collaborators with you on this book. So tell me a little bit about how this book came about.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, so the book is based on a study that I conducted that was what we call in the field a longitudinal qualitative study. So in other words, I followed a group of men over a period of 4 years and did multiple in-depth interviews with them to determine what their perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors were within the context of marriage and romantic relationships. But then taking a step beyond to say, okay, well, what were the circumstances surrounding the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows in their relationship, so that we could better frame and contextualize whatever their thoughts, beliefs, perspectives, and attitudes were. So yeah, so again, given what I do for a living, the way that I keep my job is by publishing the results of my studies. But I like to think of myself as a community engaged researcher. And so rather than simply publishing the results in academic journals that'll be nice for a conference presentation with other academics, but will never reach regular people, my interest was in putting them out in book form so that I could create spaces and opportunities to be able to discuss the findings with regular, authentic people. Right. And by regular and authentic, again, I don't mean that as a pejorative to any group of people, especially not to academics. Again, I am an academic, right? But if I'm being honest with you, many academics live in a theoretical and a conceptual sort of a world that may or may not match the lived experiences of the people that they write about, right? And so, again, as a community engaged researcher, my work is in the community. Again, I've been talking about the fatherhood program and so on and so forth. So if we aren't touching real people with the work, then it's sort of all for naught. And I'm from a place where you couldn't talk about it if you ain't lived it, right? So anyway, so authenticity is a word that I heard you use earlier, and so it certainly is a word that resonates with me, so much so that it's the first word in the subtitle of the book. And so there's a premium on touching real people with the work for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Now, with that being said, because time flies when you're having fun, so I want you to give me the Cliff Note version of these chapters so we can go through all, 7 of them, I think, 7.
Yeah.
So first of all, chapter 1, from Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man to 444.
Yeah.
Version. What's that about?
Yeah. So again, I told you much of the way that I understand the world is through cartoons and hip hop music. So As the book begins, I get into a story of how way back in 2008, Steve Harvey had a book, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, and people were just going crazy over the book all over the place. And so it was a sort of moment where I realized that, again, like regular everyday people were really, really interested in these notions and these discussions, conversations around Black love, right? And it almost seems as though there's a cottage industry surrounding the idea of how to find and keep a good Black man, right? And so anyway, so what we do there is we start with Steve Harvey's book, and we sort of bookend it with Jay-Z's album 444, where he sort of comes out and is more sort of vulnerable and introspective than he typically is. And it's about a 10-year period. So what we do is we review the major sort of pop culture that happens in that time span. And then we also review the major academic literature in that time span and make the case that we're in sort of a golden age of Black male receptivity to being emotionally expressive and vulnerable, right? And so that's the gist of what's happening in that chapter there.
So let's jump to chapter 3. Let's
Okay.
talk about sex.
All right.
So give me a breakdown.
Yeah, so of course that's a shout out to Salt and Pepper, who had a song called "Let's Talk About Sex" in the maybe late '80s, early '90s, or whatever. But anyway, yeah. So after the first and the second chapters, what we do with the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh chapters, the major themes of the book became chapters, right? So as we went through all of the interviews and read through all of the transcripts and coded all of them, the major themes, they sort of got their own chapter assigned to them. And sex and intimacy was one of the major sort of issues that guys were talking about. And so obviously sex is something that is really, really important to relationships. But what I think is an interesting finding for people who pick the book up is what you'll see is that the guys were also interested in exploring this idea of intimacy that didn't even have to relate to or be involved with the notion of sex, right? So guys were interested in how it was that they can develop really, really deep and meaningful relationships, companionships, and friendships with their mates and with their partners, separate and distinct from anything physical at all. And again, that's something that I wouldn't have predicted going into the project. And so I thought that it was something that people would be interested in hearing about. So we hear a lot from the guys about the way in which those situations influence and impact their relationships over time.
Now, chapter 4, trials, tribulations, and trauma, which I think is a really important conversation to have. So touch bases on that.
Yeah, so we're talking about the way in which the men's romantic relationships are influenced and impacted by previous traumas, right? We're talking about mental health, we're talking about mental illness, we're talking about physical abuse. Unfortunately, in some cases, we're talking about sexual abuse. And we're also talking about what a lot of the guys described as relationship trauma, just basically early relationship experiences that went negative that impacted them into the distant future, right? So as you approach or as you engage men in the here and now, you'll find them acting and behaving in all types of ways. But it's the important question is not what's wrong with you. The question is what happened to you. It's a question we rarely ask, right? But we see the manifestations of it. And
Sure.
so when a lot of what we see is the negative and deficit frame depictions and portrayals, what we don't see is the story behind that and what led to it. And so we sort of get into that as the guys were really, really courageous in sharing a lot of their history with me, a lot of their stories with me from the standpoint of things that happened to them that set them on a trajectory, either good, bad, or ugly, as it relates to their marriages and romantic relationships. And so that's what we deal with in that particular chapter.
Yeah, and one of the things I talk about a lot in my books is the importance of making peace with your past, understanding how childhood trauma still impacts your life as an adult and being willing to heal those traumas. And again, as Black men, I think we really need to have that conversation more often to help us unpack some of our emotional baggage that we don't even realize we're carrying around. Touch on love and manhood real quick. What do we have there?
Yeah, so we just get into the guys' concepts of masculinity, right? So whether or not, so the core question in that chapter is whether or not being involved in a romantic relationship has influence or impact on their ideas about what it means to be a man. And so for some of the guys, they said it did, and for other guys, they said that it didn't. But then we explore their reasons for responded to the question in whatever ways that they did. What was interesting was that for a lot of the guys, and this is what led to the interest there, was in some of my previous work, what I found is that a lot of men, when you talk to them about identity and to define masculinity for themselves, they sometimes struggle with it and they default to simply looking to be the opposite of what they think is feminine. Right. But that's so not being feminine is not an identity, right? Like that's just sort of looking to reject what you think is sort of either negative or deficit framed. And so we're looking again, go beyond that. So we wanted to explore that, and we do that in that chapter where we get into the guy's concepts of masculinity and the reasons behind that, really taking a deep dive into those types of discussions.
Wow. We need to have another conversation so we could go a little bit deeper in this, because I love where you're going with it, because this is what I've been writing about for the past 20, 25 years. But my final question here for you, and first of all, where can people find the book if they're interested? Is that something that's available, or is that only an academic?
No. Well, so to answer your question, no, it's you can get it on Amazon.
Okay.
But a better route would be to go to Roman and Littlefield. That's the publisher. Now, again, it's the book is based on a study, but it's written in a way that lay people will understand it and get a good bit of use out of it. So it's not a lot of jargon or anything like that in it. I think it's an easy read. But again, because I'm an academic, there's an academic publisher, Roman and Littlefield. And if you use the discount code LEX, LEX 30 AUTH 20, that's LEX 30 off 20. Roman and Littlefield is offering a 30% discount because, again, because it's an academic publisher, they set the prices in an academic sort of a way. So you can get a 30% discount using the discount code LEX 30 off 20 at checkout. But again, that's only if you go through romanandlittlefield.com. But the book is available on Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes and Noble and all those other places, wherever you would find books.
So as you were finishing up this book, what surprised you the most?
Well, the piece about intimacy, I think, was one. I wasn't expecting that. The prevalence of the relationship, what the guys were calling relationship traumas, and just how deep-seated that stuff was, right? So just how long people carried that stuff with them and how long it influenced and impacted their relationships. I wouldn't have expected that. But I think the biggest thing was I went into this expecting to have to pull teeth in order to get guys to sit down and talk with me. And what I found was the exact opposite. It was as if they were sitting there waiting to be asked, and I showed up and they were like, bruh, I'm glad you're here. Right. Because again, like I had no relationship with these guys previous to the study, right? Like it wasn't like we were friends and we were had any sort of previous connection. People may have known me from my work in the community, but other than that, these were people who I just came across as a part of the study, and the level of courage and forthrightness and receptivity they had to sharing what for many of them were some of their deepest, darkest, and most intimate sort of moments. That was eye-opening and certainly surprising. So the biggest sort of surprise was the level of courageousness and openness that the guys exhibited as a part of the project.
Well, I will assert that most men really want to have these types of conversations, but they don't even know they're available. They don't have access to environments in which these conversations occur. So that's why with my podcast, I give men that opportunity to have these types of dialogues and conversations, because deep down, we're longing to be loved, period. That's what we're longing for. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't have the emotional tools to experience what authentic love really feels like. And so engaging in these types of conversations, and obviously it goes a lot deeper than that, and us talks about, emotional healing and stuff like that. But again, I really believe, and especially Black men, I think we're hungry for this. I think now more than ever, we're wanting to move past the negative stereotypes, but more importantly, just feel connected, to our authentic selves and just to really be comfortable in our own skin and not wear these societal labels and wear these masks. I like to call them, we wear these masks. And I think men want to take these masks off. And so once again, that's why I do what I do, because I give men a space to take those masks off and to get real and to say, hey man, I get it. I'm there for you. I appreciate this space, because when you create that space of safety and give men the freedom to really speak from their hearts, that's where healing occurs.
Yeah,
And we need that now more than ever.
I,
So
I
with
cannot agree more. Yeah, absolutely.
so with that being said, as we wind down now, see, I love having these conversations, but time just goes by too fast.
Yeah.
But first of all, how can people connect with you if you've got social media or whatever? If you are interested in having people connect with you, how would they connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, uh, Armon Perry is the name. University of Louisville. My email address is arperr01@louisville.edu. I have a Facebook account. I have a Twitter account. I even have an Instagram, and all of them are Armon ARMON _R Perry PERRY. And so I think that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. I would again, I do want to take the time to thank you for sharing your platform with me, because I could not agree more that for me, the biggest sort of revelation in this whole project was that guys want to have these conversations. And the fact that you've been at it for as long as you have been, I think you're creating the types of spaces that guys are longing for. And if not for spaces like yours, guys will be relegated to having to sort of, in many ways, suffer in silence or just go at it alone, which is a recipe for disaster. So again, I want to salute you for the work that you are doing and have done to create and blaze these types of trails for the better part of 2 decades, and creating spaces for newer people like me to step in and talk about the work that we're trying to do, which is an attempt and an opportunity to build on the foundation that folks like you have already created. So again, I salute you for that.
Well, thank you. And I don't believe in accidents. I think everything happens for a reason, and I believe this is a divine appointment that you and I have connected because we have same intentions. And I'm sure there'll be future collaborations, and I really look forward to that because I know you and I are on the same page, and
Absolutely.
we have the same commitment. So now I want to give you an opportunity to just close with your final thoughts to the audience. Just whatever comes up for you, whatever you feel like sharing, just speak from your heart and just close out to the audience.
Yeah, so if I could share anything with the listeners, I would again thank them for taking the time to listen to the discussion, the conversation. I would hope that they walk away having received something from it. I would encourage everyone in their own circles of influence to create the types of spaces and environments where people can feel comfortable in their own skin, so they can be their authentic selves. And I would encourage them to hopefully do the same, so that as other people see you as a role model, they can feel more at ease with being whoever it is that they are. And again, if there are ways for us to connect and continue the conversation, I'd gladly do it. Again, Armon Perry, and I shared all of the social media, Armon_R Perry on Twitter and Instagram, and even Facebook as well. So again, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and whichever means of communication works best for you, Facebook, Instagram, let me know, and I'll put a link underneath the interview so that people can just, after they watch it, they can just click on it and go directly to whatever site you like using the most.
Okay. Well, I tend to use Facebook the most because again,
Okay.
brevity is not my strong suit. So Twitter puts that artificial limit on how much you can say,
Right.
uh, which puts me in a box. But so yeah, so Facebook is usually where I spend most of my time. But I'm trying to do a little bit more because it seems as though younger people work more with Twitter and Instagram than Facebook. So yeah, I'm trying to get acclimated to using them all.
There you go. All right. Well, I'll put a link and find you there. That way they can find you online. So I just want to say thank you, man, for what you're doing. Thank you for the amazing man that you are. I'm inspired by your work. Glad we've connected. Once again, I know it's by divine appointment, and I just want to stay connected. so we can continue to work and empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. So thank you for spending an hour with us. I appreciate it.
Very kind words. Thank you much.
All right, so this has been another episode that Shatter the Stereotypes. So don't believe the hype. Black men are doing extraordinary things, and this show is showcasing all of them, or as many as I can get anyway. All right, see you next episode. Take care and tune in next week. Good night.